Hey there. Tonight, let's settle in for a long, gentle wander through the Middle Ages. Dim the lights, fluff up that pillow, maybe turn on a fan for some soft background hum. If you enjoy this soothing deep dive, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And I always love hearing from you in the comments, where you're listening from, what time it is. Now, take a slow breath and relax. We're beginning with a question. How many unshakable facts about the Middle Ages have you heard that might not be facts at all? So let's unravel a few, nice and easy. Now, as you're getting cozy, let's gently turn to a pervasive medieval myth, one that involves our noses. You've probably heard that people in the Middle Ages hardly ever bathed, that they wandered around crusted with dirt, reeking to high heaven, because they feared water like it was some kind of witch's brew. This myth would have you picture townsfolk and nobles alike shuffling through muddy streets, their clothes stiff with filth, everyone smelling like a mix of wet sheep and week-old cabbage soup. It's an unpleasant image, and luckily, mostly unfair. The reality is more nuanced and more hygienic. Medieval Europeans bathed more often than we give them credit for. In many towns, public bathhouses were a common feature, sort of the community wellness centers of their day. If you lived in a medieval city like Paris or London, you wouldn't have a shower at home, no plumbing, alas. But you could trot down to the local bathhouse. For a small fee, you'd get a tub of hot water to soak in, maybe even scented with herbs. Medieval texts actually complain about people spending too much time at the bathhouse, which suggests it was a pretty popular pastime. And it wasn't just about getting clean. It was a social hub. Imagine stepping into a steamy wooden bathhouse, the air heavy with the scent of warm water and rosemary, chatter echoing off the walls. People caught up on gossip there, similar to how today someone might say, "Let's grab coffee and chat." Back then, it could be, "Shall we bathe and talk business?" Some bathhouses even offered food and drink so you could make an evening of it. And yes, a few provided additional services, if you catch my drift. Think of those as the medieval equivalent of a spa with extremely full service. In rural areas without bathhouses, folks still washed up. They'd bathe in rivers or lakes in warm weather, and in tubs at home when they could. Soap existed. It wasn't fancy artisanal lavender soap, just simple soap made from animal fats and lye. But it did the job. Even monasteries, which were quite regimented, had rules for washing. Monks typically washed their hands and faces daily and took full baths on a schedule, perhaps weekly or more, depending on the order. And the wealthy, they could afford their own private baths. Castles and manors had special rooms for bathing. If you were a lord, you might have servants haul buckets of hot water to fill a big wooden tub. Nobles sometimes even infused the water with fragrant herbs like mint, sage, or rose petals to make it a luxurious soak. Medieval royalty loved their perfumes and scented waters. They were doing aromatherapy long before it was cool. So why do we assume everyone in the past stank? We can blame a combination of later historical periods and a bit of selective memory. Ironically, people in the 16th and 17th centuries, after the Middle Ages, began bathing less, because some experts at the time thought bathing, especially in hot water, could let bad air or disease into the body by opening your pores. There was also a fear that bathing could somehow weaken you or wash away necessary oils. So in the so-called Enlightenment, many genteel folks switched to just changing linen shirts frequently to seem clean, dousing themselves in cologne and avoiding actual baths like the plague. Louis XIV of France, for example, is said to have bathed only a few times in his entire life, but practically bathed in perfume daily. Meanwhile, your average 14th century person likely bathed way more often than that French king ever did. Over time, we mixed up these eras and pinned the no-bathing stereotype on the wrong century. To be fair, the Middle Ages weren't spotless. Not everyone had access to a nice hot bath whenever they wanted, and certainly people had to tolerate more grime than we do today with our daily showers. But they didn't avoid cleanliness out of superstition. They cared about hygiene within the limits of their technology. After a long day in the fields or at the forge, a peasant might rinse off by the hearth with some warm water, scrubbing the day's dirt away as best they could. A medieval town dweller might visit the public baths on Saturday, so they were clean for church on Sunday. The bottom line, medieval people weren't walking filth piles who never touched water. That reputation is a bit of lazy, historical slander, like a bad smell that doesn't belong. How about that term, the Dark Ages? Even if you're not a history buff, you've probably heard people refer to the Middle Ages as a 1,000-year stretch of ignorance and gloom, sandwiched between the fall of Rome and the bright, shiny Renaissance. According to this notion, nothing of value happened for centuries. Supposedly, everyone just tilled fields or prayed in monasteries. Nothing new was learned, nothing beautiful created. Darkness everywhere until the reawakening. It's such a common idea that it even shows up in pop culture. You might imagine medieval folk stumbling around in dim candlelight, with no art or science to brighten their days. But this image is quite unfair. The Middle Ages were not an intellectual or cultural wasteland at all. The term Dark Ages is really a misnomer that comes from later thinkers patting themselves on the back. Sure, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire around the 5th century led to a period of disruption, and some knowledge was lost or harder to come by in Europe. But people didn't just forget everything or stop being curious. In medieval Europe, universities were founded, beautiful Gothic cathedrals were built, and technology advanced in many ways. This was the era that saw the invention or adoption of things like mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, the printing press by the late Middle Ages, and significant improvements in agriculture, the heavy plough, crop rotation, better harnesses for horses. Far from static, it was a time of many small innovations that added up. The dark label mostly reflects the bias of later Renaissance scholars, and then Enlightenment writers who wanted to portray themselves as part of a glorious revival in contrast to a benighted past. It's a PR job, essentially. To make your era look awesome, you cast the previous era as crude. Petrarch in the 14th century, one of the earliest Renaissance humanists, actually popularized the term Dark Age because he missed the glories of Rome and thought everything after was comparatively barbaric. Later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, some historians ran with that idea and really oversimplified the story. But modern historians recognize that the Middle Ages had plenty of light, metaphorically and literally. Medieval scholars were busy preserving and synthesizing knowledge. Monasteries kept books safe by copying manuscripts. Everything from the Bible to ancient Greek philosophy, to new works by Arab and Jewish scientists and philosophers. There were lively debates on theology and natural science in universities like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna. And as for art, wander into a great cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame when it's not under repair, and look at the stained glass windows towering above. Those dazzling colours and intricate designs didn't come from an age that lacked creativity or skill. Or consider the illuminated manuscripts, books painstakingly lettered and painted by hand, each page a work of art with vibrant pigments and gold leaf that literally glitters in candlelight. Does that sound like darkness to you? Even on the level of daily life, medieval people were not living in perpetual gloom. They had windows to let in sunlight, though glass was expensive, so not everyone had it. They had oil lamps and wax or tallow candles to light the night. Okay, it wasn't as bright as our modern LED bulbs, but it wasn't pitch black 24/7. People worked, read, and played music in those environments. Their eyes adjusted, and their world had warmth and illumination where it mattered. The night was darker then, without streetlights, sure, but that just made them appreciate the hearth and home all the more. And culturally dull? Hardly. This was an era of lively fairs, tournaments for entertainment. Imagine knights in armour, jousting in colourful pageantry, travelling troubadours and storytellers, and a rich tradition of folk songs and tales. Not exactly an age devoid of fun or imagination. So why the dark myth? As I said, it's partly Renaissance marketing. Every generation likes to think it's smarter than the last. The myth persists because it's convenient shorthand. Oh, nothing happened for 1,000 years. But in reality, plenty happened. It just doesn't fit into a neat, dramatic narrative of sudden progress. Real history is subtler, and to me, more fascinating. Gradual changes, lives being lived, achievements building one atop another, quietly, like sediment forming rock. There's a lot of colour in that so-called dark age, if you know where to look. Speaking of colour, let's lighten the mood with something tasty, medieval food. If you believed the stereotype, you might think medieval people basically ate bland gruel and boiled cabbage day in and day out, occasionally gnawing on a tough leg of mutton for variety. In this view, the food was either flavourless or downright revolting. You hear jokes that everything was rotten and covered in spices to hide the taste, and that no one in medieval Europe ever enjoyed a good meal. But guess what? Medieval cuisine could be incredibly rich and spicy and creative, especially for those who could afford it. Even common folk had seasonal treats and flavorful additions to their basic diet. A medieval cook, particularly in a wealthy household, loved bold flavors and often went over the top in ways that would surprise you. Imagine walking into a noble's kitchen in, say, the 14th century. It's late afternoon, the cook fires are crackling, and the air is thick with the smell of spices. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, black pepper, and nutmeg, all mingling together in various dishes. Spices were a status symbol. They were imported from far away and costly, so using a lot of them in your food was a way to show off your wealth and sophistication. But beyond showing off, the medieval palate truly enjoyed sweet and spiced flavors paired with savory. They wouldn't blink at a dish of roast meat cooked with raisins, prunes, or honey, spiked with cinnamon and ginger. In fact, one popular English recipe was called pottage, which is a kind of stew. You might find one made of chicken or rabbit, with almonds, sugar, and saffron, coming out a bright golden colour and tasting sort of sweet and sour. They loved that mix. For the nobility, cooks also paid attention to colour and presentation. They turned food into art and theatre. There are recipes for pies that, when cut open, live birds would fly out, giving diners an amusing surprise. Yes, this actually happened at some feasts. It's the origin of the nursery rhyme, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Though to be clear, the birds weren't cooked, just tucked in alive under a crust and released. Chefs at big banquets might dye dishes with natural colourings. something green from parsley, or bright yellow from saffron, or red from sandalwood. They even fashioned food into the shapes of other things. A famous trick was the cockentrice, a Frankensteinian showstopper where the front half of a piglet and the back half of a capon, a type of chicken, were sewn together, roasted as one creature, and presented as if a bizarre new animal had been served. It sounds grotesque now, and frankly, it was a bit then too. But it delighted guests with a sense of whimsy and extravagance. Now, not everyone was dining like that. The average person, a peasant farmer for instance, had a simpler diet, heavy on bread, porridge, vegetables like onions and cabbage and beans or peas. Meat was rarer for them, maybe a salted herring or a bit of bacon for flavour. But even they had ways to make things tastier. Herbs grew wild and in kitchen gardens, so things like parsley, dill, mustard seeds and sage would be used to season an otherwise plain pottage. If they were baking bread, they might mix in some rye or oats or spices if available to add variety. Cheese was common and added richness to meals, and on special occasions, feast days, weddings, harvest time, even village folk splurged a bit. They might roast a pig, or at least a few chickens, brew extra ale, spiced with something like meadow sweet or ginger, and enjoy any luxuries they could get, maybe a little honey or dried fruit from the market to sweeten a celebration. Travellers and traders did bring in goods. For instance, almonds from the Mediterranean could find their way into a rural Christmas feast, ground up with milk to make a creamy pudding. So the idea that medieval food was bland is quite off base. If anything, a modern person might find some medieval elite dishes too strongly spiced or too odd in their sweet-savoury combos. Ever tried a dish called garum? Actually, that's more ancient Roman, a fish sauce. But medieval cooks inherited it and similar tastes. They loved fermented sauces and strong cheeses. One myth is that spices were used to cover the taste of rotten meat. In truth, good spices were far too expensive to waste on spoiled meat. If meat was bad, you generally didn't eat it unless you were desperately hungry. Spices were there to enhance flavors, not to mask rot. So why do we think of medieval food as yucky gruel? Perhaps because historians for a long time focused on the diet of the poor, which was indeed plain in hard times, and because we compare anything not modern to some imagined ideal. Also, plain porridge and boiled veggies are easy to imagine and not too exciting. Maybe we unconsciously think of medieval folk as living lives as dull as their imagined mushy food, but medieval cookbooks survive that show a world of zest and flavour. They had a dish called blanc-mange, which was chicken, rice, sugar, and almond milk cooked to a paste, kind of a sweet chicken porridge, which sounds strange to us, but it was a delicacy. They loved mead, honey wine, and spiced wine, wine boiled with spices and sugar, served warm like a medieval mulled wine. They made gingerbread, not as cookies, but as a kind of spiced honey cake pressed into shapes. A lot of these recipes would actually hold their own on a Food Network show for creativity, though perhaps not to everyone's taste today. So, no, they didn't subsist on flavourless gruel unless they had absolutely no choice. When they could, they seasoned and sautéed and feasted with gusto. Now let's switch gears to another popular image from movies and Renaissance fairs. The noble knight in shining armour. Except the myth version is not so noble. It's that knights in full plate armour were clumsy walking tin cans who could barely move. And if they fell over, oh boy, they were stuck like an upside-down tortoise, legs flailing helplessly. This idea has been played for laughs in so many films and cartoons. You've probably seen a scene where a knight in armor topples and can't get up until someone helps, all while the opponent stands above, ready to deliver the finishing blow. It's almost like thinking of a knight as a medieval turtle on its back. Funny, yes. Accurate, no. Real medieval armor was remarkably well designed for mobility. When a knight was suited up properly, he could run, pivot, climb, even do jumping jacks if he really wanted to. Though I suspect they didn't, as that would look a bit silly on the battlefield. The point is, armor wasn't a cage. It was protective clothing, custom made and articulated to allow as much movement as possible. Consider a suit of late medieval plate armor from the 1400s. It weighed around 45 to 60 pounds, 20 to 27 kilograms. That's heavy compared to your everyday clothes, but not insane. Modern soldiers often carry more weight in gear on their backs. Crucially, armor's weight was distributed across the body. A well-fitted breastplate rests some on your shoulders and some on your hips. The arm and leg pieces are strapped snug so they move with you. This means a knight wasn't lugging all that weight on just his legs or shoulders. It was like wearing a second skin of metal. People who've tried on good replica armor are often surprised that they can do squats or tumbles quite readily. In fact, medieval fight training manuals depict knights in armor, wrestling on the ground, rolling and grappling. They wouldn't teach those techniques if once down, you were as good as dead. There are even historical accounts of knights climbing ladders or leaping onto horses while in full armor. So where does the turtle knight idea come from? One culprit is jousting armor. Late in the Middle Ages, jousting, the sport where two knights charge each other with lances, became a specialized event, and armor for jousting was different from armor for war. A jousting suit could be heavier, with extra reinforcement on the side facing the opponent, and with less need for mobility, since you mostly just sat on a horse and aimed your lance. Some of those suits even had attachments to lock into the saddle, or larger plates that would be impractical in a real fight. If you wore a jousting outfit in battle, you would indeed have a hard time. It'd be like wearing a football player's padding to run a marathon. But knights didn't fight on battlefields in jousting gear. They fought in more agile combat armor. It would be like confusing a NASCAR race car with a regular sedan, built for different purposes. Another source of confusion was ceremonial armor made later in the Renaissance and Victorian times, which was not always functional. By the 19th century, knights in armor were long gone, and some armors made for display or for eccentric nobles were overly heavy or poorly fitted. When people tried those on, they probably did wobble about like a robot. And then, of course, modern movies and TV sometimes choose the comedic route. A knight moving slowly or being clumsy can be a funny visual shorthand to contrast with our nimble heroes. It's entertainment, not reality. A real armored knight was a formidable warrior, not a joke. If he fell, he could get back up by himself. There were techniques to do so using the strength of your legs and the leverage of your sword or a piece of armor. These were trained fighters in peak condition. At least the good ones were. They weren't huffing and puffing, just trying to remain upright. When you realize that, you view those medieval battle scenes differently. They must have been intensely physical, with armored fighters capable of sprinting and grappling, not slow-motion chess matches. So, the next time a movie knight falls and flails comically, you'll know that a real 14th century knight might be rolling back onto his feet with surprising agility. The armor myth probably persists, because it's amusing, and because heavy armor looks like it should immobilize you to us who aren't used to it. But think of a scuba diver. The gear looks cumbersome, yet divers learn to move fluidly in it underwater. A knight trained to move in armor likewise became one with his equipment. He'd probably chuckle at the idea that he could be defeated by a little tumble. As one medieval proverb essentially goes, armor protects the body, but confidence protects the soul. And a knight had confidence in spades when clad in his steel skin, moving confidently across the battlefield. Our journey through medieval misconceptions continues, flowing gently onward. We've addressed the body and the battlefield. Now let's talk about the mind, specifically the widespread belief that the medieval church was vehemently anti-science and suppressed any form of scientific inquiry. It's a popular storyline. Picture an old hooded inquisitor shouting, "Heretic," at the first hint of an experiment, or monks burning books that don't fit a narrow dogma, plunging Europe into intellectual darkness. We get images of Galileo under house arrest as the norm, or tales of how people weren't allowed to dissect corpses, or use zero in math because the church said no. This has been dramatized so often that many assume it was just the way things were. But the truth is more complex and much less grim. The medieval church, especially the Catholic Church in Europe, was actually one of the primary patrons of learning and science in that era. Far from universally banning inquiry, the institutions of the church were where a lot of intellectual action happened. Let's remember, universities in the Middle Ages, places like the University of Paris, Oxford, Bologna, were generally started under the church's wing. They taught the liberal arts, including arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, music, which was considered mathematical then, logic, and so on. These universities produced scholars who engaged in lively debates about physics, natural philosophy, which was their term akin to science and theology. Many of these scholars were themselves clerics. Think of Thomas Aquinas or Albertus Magnus, a saint and a bishop, respectively, who wrote extensively on nature, Aristotle's works, and even alchemy. Or Roger Bacon, a 13th century friar, who conducted experiments in optics and is sometimes called an early advocate of the scientific method. These people were churchmen and also proto-scientists. They didn't see a conflict in that. That's not to say the church was a modern scientific institution. It wasn't. Its primary concern was spiritual matters, and it did have boundaries. If a new idea directly challenged core theological doctrines, it could cause trouble. The famous case of Galileo actually happened in the early 1600s, technically after the Middle Ages, but it often gets dragged in. Galileo promoted heliocentrism, the idea that Earth orbits the sun, which rubbed up against the church's official stance at the time, and certain Bible interpretations. He got in hot water, indeed. However, medieval precedents to Galileo, like Copernicus, who first formulated the heliocentric model, had a lot of their work sponsored by churchmen. Copernicus was even encouraged by some in the clergy to publish his theory, which he did right at the end of his life in 1543. There's also the myth that the church banned autopsies or dissection. In truth, by the 14th century, dissections were allowed in many medical schools, some of which were run by church-affiliated universities. Another myth is that the church banned the concept of zero or Arabic numerals. Actually, those numerals spread through merchants and scholars and were never formally banned by church law. Some individual kingdoms or cities resisted them initially for various reasons, but not as a grand religious stance. The medieval church often collected knowledge. monasteries kept libraries, and monks happily copied scientific treatises. Why? Because understanding the natural world was seen as understanding God's creation, which was a worthy endeavor. They did draw a line if they thought something contradicted scripture in a harmful way. But even that could be flexible. For instance, some medieval scholars proposed that the Earth might revolve around the sun as a theory to save certain astronomical appearances. It was discussed, though it wasn't mainstream until later. The idea that everyone who tried science got branded a heretic is just not true. To illustrate, medicine was largely practiced by people trained in church-run universities, or by monks and nuns in monastic hospitals. They studied the works of ancient physicians like Galen and new works coming from the Islamic world's scholars, and they tried to heal people using that knowledge, all under church approval. The church also actually conducted something we'd recognize as peer review. Theologians and scholars would review and sometimes condemn specific propositions if they found them problematic. The condemnations of 1277 in Paris are an example, where several Aristotelian ideas were banned from teaching, ironically to encourage thinking about God's omnipotence beyond Aristotle's system. But these debates spurred new ideas. Some historians argue that by banning certain too rigid Aristotelian notions, the church inadvertently opened doors for more creative scientific thinking later on. It's a nuanced history. There were individual churchmen who were anti-intellectual, sure, and there were brilliant secular thinkers too. But the broad brush, church-killed science story doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. Actually, the very idea of science as a systematic enterprise owes something to the medieval worldview that the universe had order, given by a creator, and was worth studying. And through all those supposedly dark centuries, monks were charting the stars to calculate the date of Easter, abbots were breeding better crops on monastery lands, and cathedral schools were teaching geometry to aid in construction of those awe-inspiring buildings. So there was no blanket ban on thinking. Far from it. The myth persists largely because of a later narrative from the 19th century called the conflict thesis, where authors like Draper and White argued that religion and science are eternally at war, and they painted the Middle Ages as the big casualty of religion's tyranny. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked that simplistic view. The Middle Ages had plenty of scholars who managed to be faithful and curious at the same time. By now you might be thinking of another bleak statistic you've heard, that in the Middle Ages, the average life expectancy was around 30 years old, meaning practically everyone died by 30 or 35, maybe 40 if they were lucky. It's a haunting idea. Imagine a world where you'd consider yourself positively elderly at 29, where parents almost never saw their children grow up, where hitting 40 was like reaching a mythical old age. Thankfully, this is a myth that comes from misunderstanding statistics. While it's true that average life expectancy at birth was low, around 30 to 35 years in medieval times, that figure is hugely skewed by infant and childhood mortality. In other words, many people died very young, which drags the average lifespan way down. If you manage to survive to adulthood, your chances of living to a reasonably old age were actually quite decent for the era. Let's break it down gently. High enough and mortality was a tragic reality. Many children in the Middle Ages didn't make it to their 5th birthday due to a host of diseases, smallpox, measles, whooping cough, etc. Lack of advanced medicine and sometimes malnutrition. Women faced risks in childbirth as well, which could cut life short. Those factors meant a lot of people died young, and that pulls down the average age at death. However, if a child got past those perilous early years and an adolescent made it through the teenage gauntlet, when things like plagues or accidents might strike, then that person had a fair shot at living into their 50s, 60s, or even beyond. We have records and skeletal evidence of people who lived to what we'd call old age. 70s or even 80s was not unheard of, though rarer than today. For example, a medieval merchant or a craftsperson might write a will in his 60s, reflecting on a long life. There were elders in villages who acted as godparents to generations, or grandparents who helped raise the young ones. It's important to note that life expectancy is an average, not a maximum. So saying it was approximately 30 is kind of like saying the average age in a certain population is 30, which could be true if you have a lot of babies and a lot of older people balancing out. Think of it this way. If a family has one child who dies at birth and another child who lives to 60, the average age of those two kids is 30. But obviously one died immediately and the other lived a full life. That's how the medieval numbers often work. In peaceful times, without epidemics, a person who made it to adulthood could expect to live maybe into their 60s. War and plague did cut down many in their prime, though, which is why across a whole population, the figures look grim. Another twist, when you see a statement like life expectancy at birth was 35 years, people sometimes misread that as nobody lived past 35. The reality is more like a huge portion of people died very young, and those who didn't often lived much longer than 35. There's an English tomb inscription from the Middle Ages that celebrates a man who died in his 80s. It was remarkable, sure, but not portrayed as supernatural, just lucky and blessed. Monks in monasteries sometimes lived to their 70s because they had somewhat stable food and shelter. Peasants living in a healthy countryside village, free of conflict, might see their grandchildren. And of course, the nobility, if they avoided death in battle or intrigue, could live long too. Look at Eleanor of Aquitaine, a famous medieval queen who lived to her 80s in the 12th century, or various popes who made it into their 70s and 80s. So this myth sticks around because the number 30 is shocking and easy to remember. It makes for a dramatic illustration of how hard life was back then. And indeed, life could be harsh. But it wasn't a conveyor belt to the grave at 30 for everyone. Actually, if you turned 30 in medieval Europe, you might heave a little sigh of relief because you'd made it through a lot of the danger and could reasonably hope to see another 20 or 30 years, barring misfortune. At 30, you might have grown children of your own. People did marry younger on average after all, and those kids might even give you grandkids before you died. A more accurate sense of medieval lifespan might be a lot of people died in childhood or youth. Those who didn't often live to middle age or older. An old age, let's say 70 plus, was uncommon, but certainly not unheard of. Thus, medieval people didn't generally think of 35-year-olds as elderly. If you hit 50 or 60, then you were venerable and probably earned the right to a bit of rest and bossing the younger folks around. Let's turn now to a particularly evocative bit of folklore, the notion that the Middle Ages were a time of constant, feverish witch burnings, with superstitious medieval folk regularly tossing supposed witches into bonfires or onto pyres. This one is tricky because witch trials did happen, but the worst of them came after the Middle Ages, not so much during. If you watch a lot of fantasy or period drama, you'd think every village had a stake permanently set up waiting for the next witch to be dragged out. In truth, medieval Europeans, were generally less obsessed with hunting witches than later, early modern Europeans were. For much of the Middle Ages, church authorities were actually skeptical about claims of witchcraft. They often thought that people who feared witches or claimed magical powers were just deluded or mistaken. Surprising, isn't it? Early medieval church texts, like one famous decree from the 900s called the Canon Episcopi, basically said, witches' Sabbaths, like the idea that women flew at night to meet with the devil, were illusions, dreams, or foolish superstitions. Believing that sort of thing, the church said, was a mistake that could itself be sinful because it gave credit to the devil's trickery. They preferred to think that no one could really do magic. Only God had true supernatural power, and that those accused of witchcraft were often just misguided, or at worst using herbs and chants that didn't actually have special power. It's not that they approved of folk healers or anything. The church would punish what it considered pagan practices or harmful sorcery. But burning at the stake was not an automatic or even common sentence for that in most medieval communities. There were some witch trials, but they were rarer and often ended in penances, like being forced to fast or pay a fine, or at worst being exiled. Execution for witchcraft was not an everyday thing in medieval times. However, as we neared the end of the medieval period, 1400s, and went into the Renaissance and Reformation eras, 1500s to 1600s, that's when the big witch hunts flared up. Why? A complex mix of reasons: social tensions, religious reformers on all sides, Catholic and Protestant, looking for enemies of God during tumultuous times, and the invention of the printing press, which ironically helped spread fear. One particularly nasty book, Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by two zealous inquisitors. It was basically a manual on how to identify, interrogate, and punish witches, and it painted witches as a vast conspiratorial threat to Christendom. The ideas in that book caught on like wildfire in the 1500s and 1600s, an era which saw tens of thousands of people, mostly women, some men, executed for witchcraft across Europe and in the American colonies. Salem's trials in 1692 were an echo of that craze. But those large-scale witch hunts are after the Middle Ages proper. In the medieval period, if something bad happened, say your cow stopped giving milk or a hailstorm ruined your crops, people might indeed mutter that a local wise woman or a cranky neighbour put a curse on them. Village folks have always been prone to gossip and finding scapegoats for misfortune. But serious accusations had to go through legal processes, which were overseen by either church courts or feudal courts, and those authorities often downplayed the witchcraft angle. They might reframe it as heresy, or just not pursue it strongly for lack of evidence. There were exceptions, a few high-profile burnings of people believed to be casting harmful magic or some localized panics, but nothing on the scale of the post-medieval witch craze. If anything, medieval people feared demons and the devil's direct influence more than human witches. They thought the devil could tempt you or afflict you, but an old lady with a broom wasn't automatically assumed to be his agent. Many supposed witches in medieval times were just seen as charlatans or misguided, not all-powerful satanic priestesses. So why do we conflate witches with the Middle Ages so much? I suspect popular fiction is to blame, plus the fact that witch burning has become a shorthand for old-timey superstition. It's more dramatic to imagine torches and pitchforks outside a thatched hut, right? And indeed, superstition was around. Medieval folks did believe in magic in various forms, and they had cunning men or cunning women who practiced folk healing or spells, sometimes running afoul of the church. But the automatic image of medieval townsfolk constantly burning witches is an exaggeration. If you time-traveled to the 1300s, you'd probably find more day-to-day worry about surviving the next winter, or praying to saints for help than hunting down your neighbor for flying on a broom. The grand witch hunts. Those were, strangely enough, a product of the more enlightened times that followed. As one historian quipped, blaming the Middle Ages for witch burnings is like blaming the 1990s for TikTok. Wrong century, though the impulse that leads to it was brewing. In medieval times, witches were more often the stuff of rumor and accusation than mass persecution. Now let's visit the iconic medieval building, the castle. If I say medieval castle, what comes to mind? Perhaps a towering stone fortress, grey and grim, looming over a bleak landscape. Popular imagination, and indeed many tourist photos, show castles as cold, colourless stone shells, maybe with some dark wooden beams, all of it austere and a bit spooky. It's easy to assume castles were always that way. Monochrome, drafty, maybe a tad depressing, unless filled with torches and large boar roasts to cheer things up. But here's something many people don't realise. Medieval castles and other buildings were often quite colourful, both inside and out. We only see them in bare stone today because the plaster and paint have worn off over centuries. In the Middle Ages, those walls had makeup on. Exterior castle walls were frequently whitewashed or plastered, sometimes tinted with colours. Whitewash is a kind of lime-based paint that would make the walls bright white and also helped protect the mortar from weather. So instead of dull grey, a castle might have gleamed in the sun, visible for miles like a beacon on a hill. Some castles and palaces even had painted designs on their exteriors, stripes, patterns, or murals. Imagine something like a grand manor painted in earthy red, ochre, and white stripes, or sporting a giant coat of arms painted above the gate in vivid hues. We have written accounts and some remaining traces that indicate castles in places like Wales and England were lime-washed in pale colours. In medieval German towns, half-timbered houses were often painted in bright reds and whites. Italian medieval townhouses might be painted in pinkish plaster. The idea that everything was grey stone is simply the result of time stripping the colour away. Inside a castle or a wealthy home, the colour explosion was even more pronounced. The Great Hall, the main gathering room, wouldn't have been just stone walls. Lords hung tapestries, heavy woven artworks, depicting scenes of hunts, battles, or myths. These added colour and insulation. They might have brightly painted shields or heraldic banners on the walls, each with eye-catching blues, reds, golds, blacks in all sorts of patterns, representing lineage and alliances. Ceilings might be painted with patterns, or even starry skies. If you visit surviving medieval palaces or churches, you can still sometimes see original paint on wood carvings or sculptures. They were often painted in lifelike colours, a style called polychrome sculpture. Statues of saints in churches weren't plain stone. They had detailed painted faces, robes in rich blues and reds, gilt halos. They looked almost alive in candlelight. Even plain stone surfaces might be plastered smooth and painted. Archaeologists have found remnants of murals on castle walls, perhaps scenes of saints, or vines and floral motifs, or coats of arms. One medieval castle in France, Château de Coucy, had a chapel where the walls were painted sky blue with gold stars, like a heavenly firmament around you. That's not dreary at all. Floors were covered with colourful tiles or rugs. In the East, even in early medieval times, rich people imported Persian rugs. In the West, they used rushes on the floor, but sometimes dyed or mixed with herbs. The furniture, too, wooden chests and chairs were often painted or carved. A great bed might have a canopy of embroidered fabric in bright colours. The clothes people wore were colourful as well. Dyes like madder for red, woad for blue, saffron or weld for yellow, etc., made for vibrant attire among those who could afford dyed cloth. So when a hall was filled with people at a feast, it would be a riot of colour under flickering torchlight, banners overhead, tapestries on walls, ladies in green and gold gowns, men in red tunics, servants carrying platters of gleaming copper and silver. Not exactly the black and white scene we often imagine. So why do we think of castles as grey? Because we mostly see them as ruins or restored to the stone, but not the paint. Paint and plaster are the first things to go over time. Take the great medieval cathedrals. Originally, many had their exteriors painted, or at least the statues on them painted. Nowadays they are bare stone, and we think that's the intended look. But medieval folks would find them strangely naked and dull without colour. When restorers occasionally repaint sections to show the original colours, as has been done at some places like the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, or the statue of David on Cathedral of Florence, the public is often shocked at how gaudy it looks by modern taste. We've come to equate stone grey with medieval, because that's what's left. It's like if future people dug up our old comic books, but the ink had faded, and they assumed we liked pale, washed-out art. They'd be missing the truth by a wide mark. Medieval life was lived in colour. Now, I won't romanticize it too far. Castles could indeed be cold and draughty in winter, regardless of the tapestries, and not every little manor house was a rainbow. But generally, people of the Middle Ages enjoyed colour and decoration as much as anyone. They lived among bright paintings and dyed fabrics whenever they could. They painted their world to make it beautiful or imposing. Colour impressed people. A brightly painted castle on a hill signalled wealth and power, much like a flashy building might today. Over time, wind, rain, moss, and neglect stripped most